Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from every single corner around the world, and a warm, warm welcome to the very first Global Deal annual high-level social dialogue forum. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's an absolute privilege to be the moderator of this critically important conversation. We're going to be together for the next 4 days, and we're going to be together at around about this time every day for the next 4 days as we really look to tackle the theme of beyond the pandemic, social dialogue shaping the new labor market. And in each of the sessions, every single day, we're going to be looking at an element of this broader theme and really beginning to unpack what might a world beyond the pandemic that is anchored in social dialogue really look like. It's such a privilege for us that all the partners of the Global Deal have come together, and this is an opportunity to learn from their experiences and their best practices in relation to social dialogue. And so we also know that as we come together, that COVID-19 and this global pandemic has really demonstrated for us the importance of social dialogue and how it enables us to tackle the challenges of the future. In this very moment, we're also beginning to learn that when different stakeholders come together in social dialogue, it is possible for us to address and find solutions to the very issues that our societies are grappling with today. And so with this broad invitation and this broad opportunity in mind, today, the theme that we're going to be looking at is building a strong and inclusive job recovery. I do want to entice you to stay with us for the rest of the week, because in session 2, which is tomorrow, we're going to be addressing inequalities, and we're going to really look at social dialogue and global supply chains. On Wednesday, in our third session, we're going to look at addressing inequalities, but really looking at social dialogue and due diligence and really getting to the meat of that conversation. And then we wrap it up on Thursday by looking at the double disruption and looking at social dialogue, digitalization, as well as COVID-19. Our format for the next 4 days is going to remain the same. We're going to kick off with an opening speaker, followed by a scene setter, and then we're going to make our way into a robust and insightful panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please accept this invitation too. And that is the invitation for your voice to also be a part of this conversation. So send us your comments, send us your questions, and I'll try my best to integrate your voice into the conversation when we get to our panel. For those of you who are going to be helping us to amplify this conversation across social media platforms, we're using 2 hashtags. That's hashtag Global Deal Forum and hashtag social dialogue. Now, as always, we try to ensure that you are included as much as possible. And so we are interpreting this conversation and this forum over the next 4 days in English, in French, and in Spanish. So you're encouraged to please follow in the language that you're most comfortable with. Ladies and gentlemen, your voice in this forum is important, and it can make an important contribution to the global deal, and it can make a difference. And so we're quite delighted that we are extending this invitation to governments, to business, to trade unions, to not only join the partnership, but to join the conversation too. And with all of that, allow me to get us started by introducing our opening speaker, the Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs in Sweden. That, of course, is Her Excellency Anna Hallberg. She is with us today. She is a Swedish politician and a member of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. She has served as Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs since 2019. And prior to this, she was also the Deputy CEO of a Swedish state-owned enterprise, which is Sweden's largest actor in business development and public financing for startups and for small and medium-sized enterprises. So we're delighted to have the Minister with us. So Minister, allow me to give you the floor as you share with us some of your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Nosy. And Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to this, to the first Global Deal high-level social dialogue forum. And before we dive into the much anticipated discussions, I'd like to take a few minutes of your time to reflect on the past, to take stock on where we stand today and finally to look, of course, at what lies ahead of us. A year and a half ago, Mr. Stefan Löfven, the Prime Minister of Sweden, an initiator of the Global Deal, spoke at another Global Deal conference. And he concluded that, it was in Paris actually, and he concluded that social dialogue is the key to success when making globalization work for everyone. For businesses, for workers, and for societies as a whole. And he also explained that globalization is often seen as a threat, but that change is not something to automatically fear. Social dialogue is the best way to ensure that long-term structural changes, be it in the transition to green technology or to platform-based employment, can benefit as many stakeholders as possible. That conference, as I said, was held in Paris, and the participants all met in the same room. I think all of us who attended that conference really have such good memories from that. And looking back during this 1.5 years, roughly, how the world has changed. But the core message of Prime Minister Löfven is more relevant today than ever. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the importance of social dialogue as a tool when faced with global challenges. In Sweden, as well as in many of your countries, companies, and organizations, social dialogue has played a key role in maintaining jobs, despite a sudden challenge and collapse sometimes in demand. It has also given workers more confidence in returning to workplaces by improving safety and protection against COVID-19. And ladies and gentlemen, the Global Deal Initiative has been instrumental in this context. Research by the OECD and the ILO, now the two hosts of the Global Deal and co-chairs together with me in the steering committee, the research from the OECD and the support unit has provided concrete evidence confirming the many positive effects of social dialogue. And I would here specifically like to mention the Global Deal's 2020 Flagship report, which highlights the close link between social dialogue, skills, and also a health crisis like the COVID-19. And if you still haven't had the time to read it, I encourage you to do so. The initiative has also been a platform for sharing know-how on what works and what doesn't work in our respective national context, of course. After all, social dialogue is not one size fits all solution, but rather a concept that highlights the benefit of dialogue over conflict. So what's the next for social dialogue and the Global Deal? Well, all of us here today, we are here because we believe in social dialogue as a tool for positive change. Be it a company working to improve the productivity of the business. I see Scania CEO is with us here with a fantastic picture in the background. That's a fantastic example, how it works in reality, how you work in Scania, for example. But it could also be a trade union trying to secure better conditions for the members, also in countries where trade unions are maybe not even allowed, but trying to break some new ground. Or a government hoping to limit conflicts on the national labor market. For me, as trade minister in Sweden, I see that as such a fantastic benefit that we can have when we try to influence new investments in Sweden, also that we have a stable labor market. So it's also very much for the governments to draw advantages out from this. My hope is that this conference will inspire you all to find new ways to engage with each other, of course, but beyond this forum. I also hope the more you will make full use of the Global Deal Initiative, for example, by setting up national Global Deal platforms in countries that can be used to further advance dialogue around pressing local, national, and global issues. Because I think very much of this is happening at the local arena. So we need to work in all channels. We also need more stakeholders, of course, to realize the benefits of social dialogue, more partners with whom to speak, and progress is actually being made right now. The need for new social contracts through increased multi-stakeholder dialogue was widely discussed at the recently held UN General Assembly in New York. So far this year, we have welcomed more than 10 new partners to the global deal. And I can assure you, at least from my point of view, I personally see to raise this issue and this fantastic initiative every time I meet a new colleague in another government and so on, and try to broaden this initiative with a partnership. And many of the companies and a number of governments are actually now on the way. I see the pipeline is very positive. And new partners, it's not only about the numbers of new partners, it's also about bringing new ideas, new oxygen, new experiences to the table. And for example, one maybe small example, but the Swedish Association of Graduate Engineers joined earlier this year. And they are involved in the project how to together with other units, strengthen structure for social dialogue within the Ericsson Group and the Ericsson Group worldwide. So that could be in a company or in a smaller context, but also, of course, at for larger partnerships. I'm also pleased to note, amongst the long list of prominent participants here today, that we are joined by Mr. Jared Bernstein, Senior Economic Advisor to the President Biden. Very happy to see you here, Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you.
And also Mr. Nicholas Schmidt, EU Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. I'm very pleased that you're with us today, Commissioner. And both the EU and the US have shown great interest, actually, in social dialogue as a tool for handling change. And as a chair of the Global Deal Steering Committee, I hope to be able to welcome you also to the official partners in the near future. And 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago, I was in Washington discussing this with the Secretary Raimondo and also USTR Catherine Tai, how we can broaden the partnership. And also, I think that very well is linked into the Biden administration's agenda. So let me then just conclude by the following encouragement to the years to come, and that is, take this opportunity, learn from each other, and discuss, have this very high ceiling here, and also find new ways and create new partnerships. So thank you so very much for listening to me in this introduction. I will stay with you, Nosy.
Thank you so much, Minister Holberg. I think the invitation is loud and clear. Take this opportunity, learn from each other, discuss all the difficult issues. You've reminded us about the importance of seeing social dialogue as a tool for positive change and the way in which we might advance conversation over conflict. And so, with that, I'm going to segue us to our scene setter, and that is by introducing Mr. Jared Bernstein, which the minister had already acknowledged. Of course, he's a member of President Biden's White House Council of Economic Advisors. He was a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities between 2011 and 2020, and also between 2009 through to 2011, he was chief economist and economic advisor to then Vice President Biden. And so, without saying more and taking away from the valuable time I know we're going to spend with him, I'm going to invite Mr. Bernstein to take the floor.
Well, thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to get this invitation. And I can't commend you enough for elevating these important topics in the way that you've done. Many policy conversations these days start with the phrase, quote, "the pandemic has revealed," with the specific revelation being some structural weakness in the social or economic fabric laid bare by COVID-19. In my comments today, and in the spirit of this well-timed conference, I'd like to reflect on these lessons, as well as any lessons we can take from the interventions our governments have undertaken against the impacts of the pandemic. Now, of course, this virus is still with us, so these lessons are incomplete, but I still consider this a rich and important area of inquiry. In fact, I'd assert that stress testing aside, we can never really understand the vulnerabilities of a system until we see how that system deals with a shock. And the pandemic has been a very large shock to our social and economic systems. I'm reminded of the old Warren Buffett adage about stock market investors. It's not until the tide goes out that you discover who's been swimming naked. So focusing largely on the US case, what are some of the things we saw when COVID pulled back the curtain? I'll begin with basic exposures of income and health insecurities, move to some broader macroeconomic observations, and then turn to ongoing lessons from the policy response that link to the social dialogue theme of our conference. Among the least surprising lessons was the way in which deeply embedded pro-COVID inequalities played out. A University of Michigan study found that Black and brown persons in the US and their communities were far more exposed to the ravages of the virus than those of whites. The uninsured and the poor were hit harder than those with health coverage and higher incomes. Regarding health coverage, it's worth reminding this international audience that most working age Americans and their families still get their health coverage through their jobs. Consider the impact of this policy infrastructure when a pandemic leads to an economic shutdown in which 22 million jobs are lost in 2 months. Those who are able to work from home, invariably higher paid workers in professions like finance, technology, and professional services, rarely missed a paycheck. Meanwhile, lower paid workers in face-to-face services experience sharp layoffs and income losses. Because women and persons of color are overrepresented in low and middle wage healthcare jobs, many kept working, but faced above average exposure to the virus. The economic insecurity of those living paycheck to paycheck was evident in initial increases many faced in simply meeting their basic needs, such as food or shelter. Food insufficiency for Black and brown households has consistently been between 5 and 15 percentage points higher than that for whites and Asian households throughout the pandemic. Especially in the US, the pandemic, wherein in-person schooling was suspended, pulled the curtain back on the absence of an accessible and affordable childcare sector, a missing market that the Biden administration is working hard to correct. Turning to macroeconomic lessons regarding the policy response to the pandemic, it's been my great fortune, as you've heard, to have long worked with President Biden on economic policy. And so I'll admit my bias up front. But I believe that when the economic history of this era is written, it will reflect the wisdom of his early admonition to his economic team that when it came to offsetting the pandemic-induced shock, the risk was doing too little, not doing too much. This lesson is especially resonant in our era of low interest rates. The Biden risk management assessment was closely connected to the insight that at low borrowing rates, the benefits of aggressive, fast-acting relief and stimulus are likely to offset their costs. Because we value the independence of our central bank, White House economists do not discuss the details of monetary policy, but it is legitimate to underscore the way monetary and fiscal policy work together in the crisis, with the central bank stabilizing credit markets and ensuring low borrowing costs while the fiscal authorities provided relief in many different forms. Those forms included direct checks to households, significantly increased and extended unemployment benefits, grants and loans to businesses, public health spending, increased food and housing assistance, support to states, and more. All told, fiscal support in 2020 and 21 amounted to about $5 trillion, or about 12% of GDP averaged over those 2 years. That's well over twice the fiscal punch applied to the previous downturn. The Biden rescue plan had 3 broad goals: get money in the pockets of the many millions who lost or were furloughed from work, get vaccine shots in arms, and help businesses, especially small and economically vulnerable businesses, get to the other side of the crisis. The Shots in Arms campaign, including the president's recent vaccine mandate, is a critical part of the recovery story. His view from the very beginning was that widespread vaccinations were an essential component of a lasting, robust economic recovery. Though the contagious Delta variant is still out there, and we have more work to do, These goals are being met. The US jobless rate just fell to 4.8%. A prominent forecast by our Congressional Budget Office pre-rescue plan predicted it would take until 2023 to get the jobless rate back down to that level. While the suffering by vulnerable groups noted above is well documented, it is equally important to point out the anti-poverty effectiveness of fiscal interventions. President Biden worked closely with congressional Democrats to expand our child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,600 for children under 6 and $3,000 per year for children between 6 and 17. Equally importantly, that credit is now fully refundable such that it finally and fully reaches the lowest income families raising kids and does so for the first time on a monthly basis. These historic changes have already driven sharp poverty reductions and reductions in hunger. Now, that's a lot of facts and figures, and as I've stressed, this isn't over. But we've learned that we have the resources, more technically, the fiscal space, to quickly help our most vulnerable populations when they are exposed to an exogenous health and economic shock. We've learned that some of that help gets out quickly, as in the direct relief payments to those who file taxes. Other help, like rental assistance, takes more work, and it involves extensive coordination with state and local agencies. Our unemployment system got essential help to tens of millions of the unemployed, but the system was clearly strained in meeting demands. Forward-looking policy stewardship means strengthening these architectural weaknesses before the next crisis. But if all we take from this crisis is how to more quickly offset the next one, we will have severely underlearned the more lasting lessons. In the words of this conference's agenda, we must apply these lessons to shape a labor market that will, quote, create productive and decent jobs for all workers for decades to come. In the words of President Biden, we must build back better. Surely that agenda requires investment in both physical and human capital. The benefits to child poverty reduction will reverberate for years to come, as high-quality research has shown that the payback to investing in kids is a big positive number, 8 to 1 in one recent study. Concretely, this means extending the fully refundable child tax credit in the American case, which is part of our Building Back Better agenda. Standing up an affordable, accessible child care and elder care sector is a critical intervention with at least two big payoffs. First, it reduces the pressure of strained middle-class family budgets, and second, it allows caretakers to find a lasting path into the job market. The U.S. has been a laggard here relative to many of your economies, but our administration intends to correct that. As we're seeing in real time, many global supply chains lack the resiliency to withstand the COVID shock. This was evident early on in medical equipment. More recently, we see it in semiconductors, transportation, logistics, and energy. This challenging aspect of increased globalization and international trade flows was insufficiently understood before the crisis, and it's an area of great focus to our administration, both in near-term efforts to unsnarl supply chain bottlenecks and longer-term efforts to invest in the economy's supply side. For those public servants like myself who are willing to learn these lessons, and I would say like the other folks here as well, a guiding principle is that within every crisis, there is a germ of opportunity. There's no denying that this pandemic pulled back the curtain on deeply embedded inequalities in all of our countries. Today and in years to come, we have not simply an opportunity to lastingly address these inequalities, but an obligation to do so. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bernstein, thank you very much. I think you have put certainly some core ideas that the panel is going to unpack and engage with. But before I go to the panel, I maybe just want to welcome back Minister Hallberg just for a minute to give her reflections on some of your thoughts that you've shared so far. And we will take those reflections and cascade them back into the panel discussion that will follow. Minister, just to give you a floor for a minute or two.
Thank you very much, Nosy. And thank you, Mr. Bernstein, for those very valuable observations. And also, I think for a Swedish minister, listening to your your thoughts and your remarks, but also the President Biden's Build Back Better agenda is such a fantastic opportunity to also form a partnership between the EU and the US, and Sweden and the US, of course, but also in the context of what we talk about here today, the growth and seeing growth as something for everyone, and seeing also that I think we all can embrace globalization, global value chains and so on, but we see the vulnerability now after this COVID-19. How can we mend this? How can we mend this together? And we have, for instance, Scania has been really hit hard. I'm sure we will hear about that when it comes to semiconductors and the lack of that kind of products in trace of the pandemic, of course. But also, how can we have a dialogue around this with companies, but also with governments? And I also see that you mentioned, I think it's very interesting, you mentioned we have the fiscals to help, but we also need, and we had the vaccines, and it's fantastic that we had them so quickly, but we also need to have structures in place, structures for dialogue, and structure for the society as a whole. So people, unions, employers, employees can have the possibility to quickly adapt to new circumstances, like the crisis like this. So this is why I think it's very, thank you, Mr. Burns, for that holistic view, because I think it's very important to start with that, but also then to build structures together, like we are talking about here today. And just to mention, I took notice of President Biden's remarks on Labor Day, which sent a very strong message also about his focus on inclusivity, also through workers-centered economic policy. And that was also very interesting in the context we are here to talk about today. Because the Global Deal is a great platform for discuss everything from skills upgrading and living wages to increase productivity, of course, and also sustainable trade. So, I think that I had a quote here from President Biden. He concluded that the US will, quote, will strive to ensure that basic labor rights and that the benefits of globalization are shared broadly throughout all our societies. And that is very much what the Social Deal Initiative is all about. So I think we have new partners at the other side of the Atlantic now coming up and very much into our discussion. And so again, thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Bernstein, for sharing your views. And I would now like to hand over to the Nosy again and for the first panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Holberg, and to yourself, Mr. Bernstein. And ladies and gentlemen, as we transition now into our panel, pulling the threads of what we've heard from Mr. Bernstein and the Minister, allow me to reiterate the invitation to you to send us your comments and send us your questions so we might integrate them into the conversation. What we're pulling into our panel discussion now, and what we've heard loudly and clearly, I think, Mr. Bernstein, you used the word, we need to strive for productive and decent jobs for decades to come, as one of the quotes that came from President Biden. So as we go into this panel discussion now, we're asking ourselves, how might we ensure that the recovery is job rich, that is gender sensitive, to borrow the words from Minister Holberg, that it is growth and recovery for everyone. And so this panel discussion really looks at how social dialogue can support the process of job recovery and job creation and recovery efforts that can also be directed towards the groups of workers who have been hit the hardest. And here we're talking about female workers, we're talking about young workers, and we're talking about workers in low-paid jobs and minorities. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to very quickly introduce our panel. I think they're quite keen to get into the substance of the conversation. We're joined by the EU Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Mr. Nicholas Schmidt. Thank you very much for being here. We know that he took office as European Commissioner responsible for jobs and social rights in December of 2019. He's also previously held the position of Minister of Labour and Employment in the Luxembourgish government between 2009 and 2018. And so I know, Commissioner, we're going to be tapping into your expertise and your experience in this conversation. We're also joined by the Deputy Minister of Manpower from Indonesia, His Excellency Anwar Sanusi. Thank you very much for being here. He is, of course, has been Deputy Minister since 2020. And prior to that, he was the Deputy Minister in the Ministry of Village, development of disadvantaged region and transmigration, a leadership role that he held between 2015 and 2020. We're also joined by the Secretary of State for Labor and Social Economy from Spain. That's Mr. Joaquin Perez Rey. Thank you very much for being here with us, sir. We know that he is also part of the European and Latin American Center for Social Dialogue, also a professor in the Spanish universities. So we really appreciate your insights that we're going to be tapping into as well. We're joined by Madame Kathleen Pacher. She is on your screens as well. She is the chairperson of the workers group and vice chairperson of the International Labour Organization's governing body. She's also the chair of the Netherlands national contact point for the OECD guidelines and the vice chairperson of the board for the Fair Wear Foundation. She's held a number of senior positions, including with the European Trade Union Confederation and the Netherlands Trade Union Confederation. So we welcome her voice in this conversation as well. We've heard Mr. Christian Levin been referred to a number of times through reference to Scania. Today, of course, he is the president and the CEO. For our global audience, Scania, of course, is a world-leading provider of transport solutions. And Mr. Levin has spent more than 25 years in the company, acquiring and leading across international jurisdictions. He is a member of the Swedish government's Electrification Commission, amongst other leadership roles. And suppose I take the very first question to yourself, Commissioner Schmidt. And that really is the big question of the moment. And the question is this: how can social dialogue help us in promoting a strong and job-rich recovery that creates productive and decent work, as we've heard from Mr. Bernstein, so that persistent unemployment is prevented from becoming structural unemployment? And perhaps you might comment as well, Commissioner, on in what ways the Commission is supporting social dialogue. So, Commissioner, let me give you the floor for that initial response.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning to our friends on the other side of the Atlantic. First, I'm very glad to participate in this high-level social dialogue forum organized by the Global Deal. I had been previously involved in the Global Deal. I remember one of the first meetings at the OECD, I had the honor to participate. And I think the initiative extremely valuable because our objective is indeed to shape globalization, to make globalization fairer, more inclusive. And I think here, a lot of initiatives in this context are going into in this direction. Now, when the crisis started in Europe, and we noticed that the economy, due to confinements, closing downs of sectors, was really plunging, one first initiative was taken. And I would say that was the lesson from the previous crisis, and this was the introduction of short-time work. Short-time work had been introduced during the financial crisis by a few member states, and it had shown very efficient because it allowed a much more rapid recovery because people had maintained their jobs, they had stayed in employment and kept especially their skills. So the Commission worked very much to make this short-time work schemes applicable in all the member states. And that's what we managed. And we helped especially the, let's say, financially more fragile member states through a 100 billion support program, which has been used largely. And the consequence was we saved a lot, I would say, hundreds of thousands of companies, but we saved also millions of jobs. We consider that probably a few millions of jobs were just saved. We supported member states. And so now the recovery has been much stronger. If we hadn't did that, first we would have a sharper decrease in output and we would have a more complicated recovery. So I think this was our first initiative. And this was done in most of the member states, also in a context of social dialogue. When you introduce short-time work systems in a company, well, you have to discuss with social partners, or at least it's much more efficient, it's much more favorable to have this kind of collective agreements on introducing short-time work schemes and using sometimes also the shorter working time to get people into skilling, because that's my second point. What we try to do is really knowing that the post-pandemic would not be exactly like the pre-pandemic, that the economy was changing a lot, mainly due to digitalization, and this was even accelerated. We proposed to invest more in people, to invest more in skilling, and also a good skills policy at national level, at European level, but national level and at company level is better performed if social partners come together and discuss about the schemes. So in that sense, social dialogue is favorable to a more resilient economy, to a better recovery, and also not only to save jobs, but also to help people to transit from existing jobs to other jobs. And that was another initiative we took, which is called EASE, which was a labor market policy to facilitate transitions from jobs which were lost during the pandemic or because of this acceleration of transformation on the labor market to new jobs. Now, you know that Mr. Bernstein now, he referred to the program in the US. The Commission launched a very important program of 750 billion euros, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which has now to be applied into member states through national plans. And we insisted very much, first on the investment in green transition, second in the digital investment in digital, and also investing in social infrastructure. So, and to achieve this goal, we wanted social dialogue to function, to associate social partners in the implementation of this recovery and resilience plans. This happened at European level. This happened in most countries of the European Union, in some with a stronger social dialogue culture better than in others. And just to conclude is, you know that Europe likes to say that our economic model is social market economy. And social market economy means that social partners are part of this economy. They have to be involved. They have to be really participating in the design of economic and social policies. And by the way, those countries who dealt well also during the pandemic are those countries where the social market economy, where social partners are more involved than in others. Thank you.
Commissioner Schmidt, I think some excellent remarks as you speak about how social dialogue really allows the social market economy to come alive. But there's some ideas that you spoke about as you were speaking about the introduction of short-term work, how social dialogue helps to prepare workers for the change, to prepare them for the transition. And maybe I thought a good idea is to maybe to go to Mr. Levine and test this and ask how social dialogue was used at Scania, because we know, Mr. Levine, that recovery from the crisis definitely does come with change. And so the question I'd like to bring to you is, how did Scania engage social dialogue to better prepare workers, as the commissioner has indicated, to manage this change and also to anticipate that change that was about to come?
Yeah, thanks, Nosy. And just before starting, to say I'm honored to be among such distinguished panelists to discuss these important topics. Yeah, you know, to Scania, by no surprise, perhaps social dialogue is deeply rooted in our history with a very strong cooperation with our employees in the employee organizations, as well as our very humble corporate culture, where we work a lot with our core values and what we call the Scania way. And I mean, our ultimate goal is to drive the shift towards sustainable transport systems. And I think that's also, of course, ultimately an area where the social dialogue will support. So One of our principles is early involvement, meaning that we include the perspective of the employees in basically all decision making on all levels. And I think that is not making us slow, as some would say, but that's actually making us faster and make us adapt better to difficult situations or situations such as the ones you mentioned, Nosy. So if we take the pandemic as a huge example, of course, of stress on our system, and with huge disruptive things happening in the whole environment, social dialogue was really central for us to manage this reality. And I'm very proud to say that we managed to do that and to find solutions, in terms of short-term work that was already mentioned, but also how we handle early retirement schemes, the leave of absence, etc., all together with our employees. And as a consequence, we did not have to lose one single employee, which is pretty amazing given that we lost 70-80% of our sales basically overnight. Right now we are in the middle of the semiconductor crisis, so if of course this is a consequence of the COVID, but it comes like a second wave to us just in the middle of the recovery, hitting the automotive sector extremely hard. And I mean, once again, without this creative dialogue that we have ongoing with all parties, there wouldn't be a chance for us to solve this issue. And I must say, on all levels and in all parts of the companies, the best solutions that we have found so far are not coming from management. It's really coming from the discussion with the employees. And I just, sorry to prolong 10 seconds more, I'm going to say a beautiful example out of a Kenyan operation, and maybe a market where we would not expect it, with huge difficulties. Of course, the best examples on how to save the company, how to keep business going in the middle of a pandemic in a very difficult situation was coming from the employee side, and we adopted to it. So I can only say that I think the initiative like the Global Deal really has the potential to make social dialogue a tool to transform in all places, on all levels, and to, as we say, drive the shift for everyone. So,
Ms. Levin, thank you for sharing that beautiful story, especially of how your Kenyan operations responded to the invitation that social dialogue creates, and that is the invitation to lean in to the conversation, for voice to be heard. I also heard you say something very important in this conversation, that social dialogue actually made us faster and more effective, and that's so important to dispel the idea that it slows down getting the job done. But if I reflect back to one of the many things that Minister Holberg spoke about, she also extended an invitation to say, we need to look at global deal platforms at a local level. We need to put on our national hats as we think about social dialogue. So maybe Deputy Minister Sanusi, let me come to you, because I know that one of the things that Indonesia did on the back of the pandemic to ensure that the recovery created jobs was really to try and attract foreign investment. And one of the ways that Indonesia did this is to reform the 2003 Manpower Act. I'm keen to understand, Deputy Minister, one, what concrete measures came out of that particular reform, but more importantly, how was social dialogue an enabler of some of those results? If you could speak to us to that, Deputy Minister. Deputy Minister, if I kindly ask you to unmute. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Nosy. Good morning, good afternoon, and then also good evening to all distinguished panelists. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting question. Yeah, as we know, that's the dynamics of global economic change due to the pandemic require a quick and precise response. Without structural reforms, economic growth will certainly slow down. The 2020 Manpower Act reform in the form of the Omnibus Law on job creation is carried out in the context of creating and expanding job opportunities to accommodate new workers and encouraging the development of cooperative and micro, small and medium enterprises, quality investment, simplification and harmonization of regulation, and licensing, as well as the creation of a quality job. In addition, the Omnibus Law on Job Creation also discusses the use of foreign workers, certain time work agreements, outsourcing, working hours, rest periods, termination of employment, wage, and the implementation of the job loss guarantee program in Indonesia. Therefore, it is hoped that this reform could be a solution on the problem of unemployment and the new workforce who have not had the opportunity to work. Furthermore, to providing protection and convenience for micro, small, and medium enterprise and cooperative to be able to enter the formal sector through ease of establishing, licensing, and coaching. The Omnibus Law on the Job Creation also has another positive goal, namely creating new jobs through increased investment, whilst increasing protection for labor workers. The Omnibus Law on Job Creation reorganized policies that were previously considered to hinder the entry of investment into Indonesia. The regulation of previous regulation and policies is expected to create an easier and more friendly investment climate. It is done as an effort to realize a stronger Indonesian economy so that Indonesia could become one of the 4 economic power in 2030 or 2035. Among the derivative rules of Omnibus Law on Job Creation that aim to encourage investment are Presidential Regulation number 10/2021, which regulate the investment priority list. The government has determined more than 1,700 business fields open for investment, 245 priority business fields, 89 business fields allocated for partnership with cooperative and small medium enterprise, and 46 business fields with certain requirement. The government of Indonesia also offers various fiscal and non-fiscal incentive to investors who invest their fund in the priority business field. I would like to mention some maybe other convenience of the Omnibus Law job creations, such as like support for a cooperative is of establishing cooperative by setting a minimum number of 9 people, and cooperative can apply Sharia business. Sharia is Islamic business principle. And then also with regard to the progress of community plantation in the forest area, the community is given a permit legality for the utilization of existing land in the forest area, where for community land located in the conservation area, the community can still use plantation product with supervision from a government. For fishermen also, the licensing process for fishing vessel had to go through several agencies. With the Omnibus Law on Job Creation, it is only needed to process it at the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. The Omnibus Law on Job Creation is a policy that can benefit for society and particular and the Indonesian economy economy in general. The process of license investment to Indonesia become faster and easier so that economy is expected to turn around soon. Rapid investment will also encourage the growth of small, micro, and medium enterprise to absorb labors. With the ease of the investment process in Indonesia, more companies hopefully will invest, both those that create new business and those that develop their business, so that there will be the creation of new jobs.
Deputy Minister, if I could just maybe pause you there, because I think you've given us so much excellent insight, and I look forward to coming back to unpacking more of what you've said. But what has been clear to me as we are listening to you is, how this particular reform is one of the really good examples around how structural changes that have a focus on workers that work for society and work for the economy. I've heard you talking about simplifying the regulation, making sure that licensing happens, making sure that Indonesia becomes an attractive investment destination, and how, if we get that right, we create new jobs, we create more industries, we create more opportunities. And I think that's really in the spirit of showcasing what is possible when social dialogue is in play. Allow me maybe then to go to Madame Pashier with the next question, because Madame, one of the things that we've heard from Mr. Bernstein, from the minister as well, is the importance of not losing sight of the most vulnerable. We know that the pandemic has hit low-wage workers and workers in unstable employment situations or relationships absolutely the hardest. And when we listen to Deputy Minister Sanusi, we hear him talking about how these people that make up the small and medium-sized enterprise space as employees are the backbone of the economy. They're the backbone of society. So the question to you, Madame, is how can social dialogue and collective bargaining be used to put these very vulnerable workers first? If I could ask you to unmute, Madam.
My apologies.
Please proceed.
Let me focus here on what essential and frontline workers, and think care, cleaning, retail, but also meat production, transport, and seafaring. All these people got applause, but most of them are still in low-paid, precarious employment and with high COVID risk. Many of them are women, people from racialized communities, migrants, and young people. And your question to me is how to put these workers first. But maybe it's better to ask how to ensure they are no longer put last. Because most of this is due to deliberate policy choices made in the last 3 decades. First, mainstream economists and financial institutions promoted flexible labor markets, putting the burden of flexibility on workers' shoulders. Second, ill-guided austerity policies cut down on public spending and public services with detrimental effects on wages and working conditions, also leading to understaffing in care and education, while also reducing support for working families. And third, in addition, development of business models separating control of the product from responsibility for those producing it, leading to a situation of control without responsibility, or one could also say outsourcing of responsibility. As you say, workers in the most vulnerable positions with the weakest bargaining power are paying the highest price for this. And unions trying to organize the relevant workers are confronted increasingly with this fissured reality. The employer of the workers is often not the enterprise or institution where the real profit is made or the decisions are made on the cost of labor. So what role for social dialogue? I have 3 brief examples. One is inclusive collective bargaining practices. Research has shown sectoral bargaining is more effective in addressing outsiders on the labor market and including precarious workers. And one example from my own country, the Netherlands, recently we had a fight in court on the employment status of Uber drivers, which was won with the effect that the collective agreement for the taxi sector is now applicable. However, there is still a fight going on because Uber is appealing from this verdict. Secondly, what we need is social dialogue at national level. And we hear several examples of that today. But from my own country again, in recent times, the Tripartite Social Economic Council adopted unanimously an advice to our new government to be with the title, Security for People, an Agile Economy and Recovery of Society. The central message is that the COVID crisis has exposed a number of structural problems, also in the Netherlands, which must be urgently addressed. And when it comes to the insecurity on the labor market, the Social Economic Council clearly warns that the Dutch flexibility model has gone too far and recommends that the labor market of the future must provide all workers with long-term and sustainable work and income security, which allows people to combine work with learning, caring, and a private life. Last but not least, we need cross-border responsibility along supply chains. In the 21st century, we really need cross-border accountability mechanisms to ensure and enforce minimum social standards such as freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, a living wage, employment status, etc. But I know that this issue is certainly on your agenda of this conference in the next few days. Thank you.
Madame Pasher, thank you very much. And I think the reframing of the question is absolutely insightful. It's not about putting them first, but it is ensuring that they're not persistently and structurally lost. As you raise those three examples of inclusive collective bargaining, social dialogue at a national level, as well as cross-border, looking at cross-border supply chains, which is certainly one of the elements that we're going to be focusing on specifically in the session tomorrow. You raise some very important lenses to which we need to bring into this conversation. And so I want to go to the Secretary of State, Mr. Ray. And Mr. Ray, we know that in Spain, there has been success in concluding several tripartite agreements, specifically to address some of the initial shocks that came from the pandemic, whether it was short-time work schemes or whether it was improving the health and safety protocols. The question to you, sir, is this. Is social dialogue also being used or mobilized to draw up the recovery and resilience plans, which we know are important if in order to access the recovery spending from the European Recovery Plan, or broadly known as Next Generation EU? And I'm more interested in the second part of the question, which is, what are the first outcomes of this dialogue that you can begin to share with us?
Muchas gracias, Nosy. Es un absoluto placer.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to share this forum with the Commissioner and with the other high-level colleagues. I would like to convey greetings from our Minister of Labor, who unfortunately could not join us today. And I would like to congratulate the OECD on last week's global tax agreement on the 15% rate. In Spain, thanks to the EU assistance, which the Commissioner has mentioned a few minutes ago, we have had a policy of a labor and social security policy that has centered on the most disadvantaged members of our labor market. This has allowed us to have early successes in the labor market, in terms of labor and in terms of social protection. In the former crisis, it took our country more than 10 years to get back to the pre-crisis labor levels, or employment levels, excuse me, whereas now we are already back to pre-pandemic employment levels already in barely a year and a half. We have a permanent dialogue with all social interlocutors, all social actors, talking to trade unions and to employer organizations, where something that was very important to guarantee the best possible success of our policies and to make them socially fair. So social dialogue was almost an obligation for us in Spain, and it has given already good results. It has helped us to resolve the sanitary or the health crisis from a labor and employment perspective, but it has also allowed us to overcome some obstacles that have appeared during the pandemic. For instance, how to protect workers of digital platforms. Spain, in one of its social dialogue agreements, established for the first time the protection provisions for these workers. We also incorporated grants or subsidies for disadvantaged workers that had suffered a lot during the crisis. For example, home workers and remote workers as well. Our social dialogue has allowed us to move forward on a lot of fronts. And I agree with the president of Scania. Social dialogue speeds things up and allows us to have a very good analysis of what's going on in the labor market. And we intend to follow that route for our resilience plans. I think that the EU plans are very ambitious, and we need social dialogue in all of that initiative to have more fair, more resilient labor markets, and also labor markets that allow us to, or recovery plans in general, that allow us to help the most disadvantaged and the ones that have suffered the most during the crisis. Social dialogue, I believe, is a guarantee of success in this sense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. And just listening in to some of those positive outcomes that have come out as a result of social dialogue, the protection of workers on digital platforms as just one example. But I must say, one of the sound bites that stands out to me is how social dialogue enables the opportunity to listen to each other. And when we listen to each other, we're able to journey towards a place of collective change. Now, there are two things that are happening at this point in the conversation. One is our audience has begun to flood in our chat box. They have lots of questions. They have lots of comments. But the second thing is that I still have one more question that I want to put to all of you. So I'm going to put everybody under pressure. And this time, I'm going to be very strict in terms of the response time. I really want our audience to get direct access to each and every one of you. And I'm going to ask everyone the same question as we go into the second round. One of the things we heard from Mr. Bernstein was how this particular crisis really can be considered as an opportunity for us to build back better, including building back a gender-responsive labor market. The question that I'd like to put to each of you is, what in your view is the number one issue that needs to be different in a post-pandemic world and a post-pandemic labor market in particular, and how can social dialogue help? So I know that there are many issues. I just want to focus on the number one issue in your view, and how do you think that social dialogue can help us to achieve this particular change? So let me go back to where I started. Let me go to the commissioner first. Mr. Schmidt, your number one issue, and how do you think social dialogue can play a role?
Well, I think that number one issue is inequality and the value of work. And what can be done to restore the value of work? That's supporting, developing, strengthening collective bargaining. This is a form of social dialogue. It's the active form. It's collective bargaining, which the Commission, by the way, wants to develop. We have made proposals on minimum wage, but we have also made proposals, especially on collective bargaining. And I think this is something to restore the balance in our economies, the balance in our societies, with a view that we have to reduce inequality, and inequality at the level of income, but also inequality between men and women. This is something which is also high on the Commission's agenda. Thank you.
Commissioner, I think you've set a really good precedent. So to my other panelists, that was concise, to the point, and really powerful. So inequality from an income perspective, from a gender perspective, and of course, looking at the value of work, the Commissioner is highlighting the active element of social dialogue, which is collective bargaining, and saying this is our pathway to restoration. So Mr. Levine, I came to you next, so I'm not sure if you're going to do a better job than the Commissioner or not, but let's give you an opportunity to put on the table your one big issue and how social dialogue can play a role.
If I try to be both precise and down to earth, I would say it's, how to get back to the new normal and defining that new normal together in the workplace, to try to create a workplace which is both flexible, allowing for work-life balance, and at the same time more efficient. And I think we learned a lot of good lessons during the pandemic on how to do that. And we are right in the middle at Scania now rolling out what we call the playbook, which is a global view on the hybrid work model that should allow for flexibility, that in terms should allow for a much more diverse workforce in the company, and that will make us more competitive. So I would answer a new hybrid model of work.
Mr. Levin, I think it's a very close call. I wouldn't want to be the judge of that, but I do want to say that those are really powerful, a powerful big issue, and that is the opportunity to define the new normal together. And the elements you speak about, elements of flexibility, of efficiency, but also the opportunity to build more diverse organizations that lead to greater competition. And I do not doubt that many of our partners around the world listening in today are looking out for that playbook on the hybrid world of work, because certainly somebody needs to do the work of consolidating some of that best practice. Now, I'm trying to remember my pathway once again. So, Deputy Minister, I think my pathway brings me to you. Deputy Minister, from your perspective, the one big issue that needs to be different in a post-pandemic labor market, and what is the role of social dialogue in getting that right?
Yeah, I think maybe social dialogue will certainly is very influential and provide benefit for inclusiveness. I would like focus on the women workers in the world of work. By encouraging women working workers unions or labor unions administrators to frequently conduct social dialogue with company management about the importance of building a culture of zero tolerance for harassment. Social dialogue is carried out in the company, in the company environment in order to create a comfortable working environment for the women. Form of sexual violence or harassment, both verbal or non-verbal, must not occur or happen to workers, especially women workers. The initiation of a social dialogue with company management must come from women because women are more sensitive than men. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I see this is quite a tight performance that we have, but a very, very important point that the Deputy Minister raises, and that is, this is an opportunity for us to change a very problematic element of some organizational cultures, and that is the harassment of women in the workplace. And if we can leverage social dialogue to change mindsets, we might be able to leverage it to change behavior as well. Thank you very much. And I know there's a question around culture that's come through. So this is also a very important element that you're bringing into the conversation, Deputy Minister. Madam Pashia, let me come back to you. I'm tracing my steps backwards. Your number one issue, Madam, that you would like to put on the table, that you say, if we get this right, we might really begin to talk about a post-pandemic labor market that has built back better. And I'm keen to understand, in your view, what role do you see for social dialogue in getting there?
Let me draw your attention to an issue that was already addressed just before. The pandemic has a feminine face. Women in essential sectors and jobs have sustained societies and economies. They were also disproportionately impacted by the crisis. And the pandemic, in my view, has shown that we can no longer put gender equality as an afterthought to any policy regarding the post-pandemic labor market. In my previous contribution, I focused on precarious work. And here I really want to support the words of Mr. Nicolas Schmidt. I think value of work and dignity are very much the buzzwords that we need to apply when we really want to address vulnerable workers at the bottoms of our labor market. Precarious work has a very strong gender dimension. Precarity is also connected to gender-based violence and harassment. It is important, but not sufficient to address gender-based violence as a separate issue. There are strong links to the status of women in society, the lack of a proper income, and no respect or value of their work, and very insecure work arrangements. So empowering women must be a key objective from the very start of the recovery, ensuring a gender dimension to all measures and policies. This must provide women with the necessary tools, such as a proper stable job, an adequate wage, full social security coverage, access to childcare and paid leave facilities, quality public services, etc. And the ILO has called for a transformative agenda on gender equality, both in its centenary celebrations, but also this year in its COVID call to action. And let me just finish with the issue that is very relevant for today. There is strong evidence that collective bargaining leads to more equal wages and working conditions for women, for instance, providing for more transparent and objective wage structures. During the COVID-19 crisis, many social dialogue initiatives were taken, both at sectoral and national level, to address various issues such as teleworking, working hours reductions, care leave, among others. And also in the Netherlands, issues like childcare figure there alongside other important measures in the area of public services. So I think I want to add to this very important issue of the value and dignity of work in general, the strong gender dimension to this issue.
Madame Pachet, an excellent contribution that has been very well unpacked as you speak about the impact of empowering women through income, empowering them also through the respect and valuing their work. And I think the call to action is also loud and clear that this has been a peripheral issue for the most part. And what I'm hearing you saying that in a post-pandemic world, this needs to be a central issue, especially because we know that we're dealing with half of the global population. So we've got to get it right, and we need to be deliberate about getting it right. So let me go to Mr. Ray once again, and let me bring your voice into the conversation, sir. Your number one issue that you think we need to address for a as we work towards a post-pandemic world, but one that is built back better, one that is gender responsive. What is that issue, and what is the role of social dialogue?
Bueno, interesantísimo este debate.
Very interesting. This debate is really fascinating and very important. I would say that the main lesson from the pandemic is that those that suffered the most were the most precarious people, women and the youth. But we have also learned from those that we have needed the most, those first-line workers that were doing the essential tasks. Those are the ones that we usually treat the worst. Think about working conditions. And the way out of this crisis can only happen if we build a more equal reality. The job place, the workplace, work market cannot be a suffering space. It cannot be compatible with exclusion and poverty that is being clear through the crisis. And people cannot feel excluded in the market space. And women cannot be excluded because they are 50% of world population. So we need to create a decent working space with rights. And this is the basis that the ILO is doing, a great job that they are doing. Gay Ryder has talked about a better normality many times. Well, this normality has to be more equal with more bargaining collective agreements and making more mainstream in the decent work concept.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. First line workers and how we've treated them. One of the things I think Mr. Bernstein started off with, he said, when the tide comes in, we get to see who's been swimming naked. And it's such an important analogy that has exposed many of the behaviors that have been a reflection of the labor market to date. And so the invitation for us to reimagine how we treat first-line workers, to reimagine what the workplace needs to look like. The quote that, to quote you, that the workplace cannot be a place for suffering and exclusion and a space for poverty. We've got about 15 or so minutes left together, and I'd like to maybe just bring in a couple of questions from our audience. One of the questions I'm bringing to you, Commissioner Schmidt, and this is the question. The question says, according to the preliminary findings of a Eurofound report, most of the EU countries record low quality standards of social partner involvement in the designing phase of the national recovery and resilience plans that have been submitted for the next generation EU funds. The question to you, Commissioner, is how can you as the European Commission ensure that worker representatives have a real voice in the implementation phase of this process? Over to you, Commissioner.
Thank you. I'm aware that the involvement of social partners in the designing of national plans has been very varied. It has been better in some member states and less developed in others. So I think this is something which we have now to deal with, that social dialogue is essential, especially in a period of big transformation. We have the Green Deal as one of our major projects. I mentioned already digitalization, and we can only be successful in this transformation if social partners are directly involved at all levels, national, European, and also at the level of companies. We will have next year a big conference on social dialogue with ideas which we will submit to social partners, but also to national governments. So in order to show that social dialogue is essential, especially to manage the big transitions, but also just to talk about the more global perspective, we have to defend social dialogue, which means we have to defend the rights of social partners. This is essential. We cannot have social dialogue without the rights of social partners, without free trade unions. So this is also something which is extremely important all over the globe, having strong and social partners, having in a free society, in free societies. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you very much. I think one of the things that the Minister invited us to do is to make sure that we're using the space to tackle some of the more difficult conversations. And I think the acknowledgement that we haven't got it right at the same level across all markets is an important one, and that we can do a better job. What I've also heard you saying is we need to focus on the rights of social partners. So that's a very important part of the conversation that we're going to unpack further. I've got a few more questions. I'd like to bring this one to Mr. Levine. And because the gender conversation and the gender element of this conversation has been a very important one. The question is this: is the COVID-19 pandemic has had a gender impact, with female workers in many ways suffering more than men. What role can social dialogue play in addressing these increased gender imbalances? We've heard Madame Pashir speak to the gender element, the Deputy Minister speak to the gender element. I'm keen to hear from you, Mr. Levine. How do we ensure, according to this question, that social dialogue plays its role in addressing the imbalances that women encounter in the workplace?
Yeah, no, excellent question. I think, and of course, which is totally unacceptable, and what we're striving for is of course more equal opportunities and career possibilities for women, and especially in our sector that has traditionally not been very strong. We tend to think, what I was into before, by creating a more flexible work environment and more flexible workplace, we can actually allow for a better work-life balance. And that is many times what is hindering in many markets women more than men to make a career. But of course, that is not enough. I mean, there's so much more that we need to do in all areas of how we run human resources in the company. I mean, from the way we hire to the way we develop to the way we train and retrain for new skills. And to really keep that perspective in mind all the time, as we are dominantly men in the company, and we are then somewhat unconsciously biased, all of us. We need to constantly remind ourselves that this is not good enough. And I think I'm not sure in Scania what you say is true, that women has been hurt more than men. I certainly don't hope so, and I don't think so. But it's certainly true in the general work environment. And I think here also global big companies such as our own needs to be good examples, and showing the rest that is not the way to be successful. That is not the way to win more customers, and that is not the way to attract good people to your company, which means that in the end you will not be around.
Ms. Levin, thank you very much for that. And I maybe want to just take the same question to Madame Pacher as well, because you know, as I listen to Mr. Levin, you're speaking to being very deliberate around uprooting unconscious biases, being very deliberate around reviewing hiring processes, the broad sort of human resource remit. But I'm also hearing you speak about being clear that women are part of the competitive edge, and that if the culture enables their performance, we then become more competitive. Madame Pacher, I just want to put the same question to you, and that essentially is, what is the role of social dialogue in ensuring that we're able to address gender imbalances that play themselves out in the workplace? What would you like to offer, in addition to what Mr. Levin has said, to the person who's asked the question?
Well, I certainly would say, first of all, that I tend to challenge Mr. Levin on the fact that his women were not suffering more. And I just, maybe in Sweden, it was not the women that took up the educational tasks for their children being at home and doing more of the care tasks around COVID-19. Then you are a very special country, because in most countries of the world, whatever kind of jobs women had, they were certainly hit harder than men, which doesn't mean that I don't recognize also what you are saying, that we, of course, need to invest in all the possibilities. And here I tend to have a problem with the word flexible working places, because I think the word flexibility by now has been too much burdened with flexible contracts, flexible meaning precarious. At the same time, I do think it is very important, and certainly something that can be dealt with in collective bargaining, both at company level, but also sectoral and national, which is to ensure more family-friendly and worker-friendly working hours organizations, that workers have a say in how their work is organized, and that they can contribute to the development of the company, also by participating in works councils and in unions, etc., which is another challenge that many women are facing, that when this is all put together, it is just burdening them again very much. So when it comes to social dialogue and gender equality, I think it's very important that women participate in unions. It is very important that unions allow women to play an important role in leadership. It is very important that they play an active role that they get the opportunities in companies and sectors to grow and also have a career. And for that, it is certainly enormously important that public services support workers, men and women, to be able to have a rich life also in work and outside work. And for that, it is inevitable that we need social dialogue and women in social dialogue participating actively to tell everybody else what it is that they really need.
Madame Pacher, thank you very much. I did see the Deputy Minister nodding as you're speaking, but I want to bring a different question to you, Deputy Minister. There's a trade unionist from Cambodia asking, what do we do if an employer does not want to negotiate? And the reason that I'm putting the question to you is that your contributions were really much around, the structural policy reforms. You were talking about incentives in place to attract foreign direct investment. So to paraphrase the question, how do we incentivize everyone to want to come to the conversation, to the table, to have the dialogue? So your thoughts, Deputy Minister, on that question. What to do if an employer does not want to negotiate?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting question. Yeah. And then also it's, of course, maybe on the ideal condition, we would like bring all the partners, all the partners, maybe whether it's the trade unions or maybe and then also is corporate or governments. So I just want to give one example from Indonesian case. We have like forums that try to facilitate, the interest from trade union and then also the corporates and then also the government. The forum, the social dialogue forum, is namely is tripartite. So it's from three parties. They will bring all the issue regarding anything, and then on this forum. This is actually the forum is created by government. Of course, in some cases, the trade union is rejected. All the proposal who coming from, say, both from the government and then also from cooperation. Of course, this one is first of all, maybe we try to persuade, we try to negotiate, and then also we have such maybe instrument and how to bring the trade union wants to come to the on the dialogues. Yeah. Yeah. This is quite happen in my country, especially in Indonesia. We also adopt like a democratic system. We provide them, we give them like the channels to speak their voice, and then of course and especially during the pandemics, this also is the trilateral meetings, is tripartite meeting is quite occurs. And then also this one also is very effective to solve any kinds problem that's coming from either is from trade unions and then also coming from the corporate. That's our one of our examples.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I do wanted to get to Mr. Ray, but Madame Pache, I saw your hand pop up, so I want to give you 20 seconds to add to what the Deputy Minister has just said.
I just wanted to say to this person from Cambodia that asks what to do when my employer refuses to talk to me. I hope I can do this in 20 seconds. But first of all, it's very important that countries like Cambodia and others recognize the freedom of association. Do they really recognize the union as being in its right to take action, to talk to an employer? Do they have the right to collective bargaining? And do they then also have the right to take action if the employer doesn't listen to them? Because this is what is happening in countries that have all rights there, all the basic fundamental rights. And do the countries that have trade relations with Cambodia or other countries require all countries to have those basic fundamental rights in place? And I think this is really very important.
Madame Pache, thank you very much for reinforcing the significance and the importance of shining the spotlight where we still need to ensure that some of the rights, for example, that the Commissioner was speaking about are recognized. Mr. Ray, I want to come to you with a question from our audience, and the question is, how can social economic councils ensure a real contribution to building a strong and inclusive jobs recovery? Your thoughts on that question, please, sir.
Muy bien. Bueno, en primer lugar quiero decir que
first of all, I would like to say that I agree wholeheartedly with Commissioner Schmidt and with Madam Paschier. I think that for social dialogue to work in our societies, we need to make sure that human rights exist and can be exercised, and particularly the ones related to labor. I think that socioeconomic councils are entities that insert the social dialogue in the standard-setting dynamic of states. The idea is to incorporate structurally social dialogue into public procedures, policy-making procedures. And I think that this has more chances of success. It's not only important to ponder whether social dialogue happens or not, but whether it's fair and inclusive, and whether in it really robust and free trade unions are actually participating or not, and whether actual agreements can come out of that or not. Thank you.
Credibility of that process becomes incredibly important. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've just made it in within the time for us to wrap up our conversation. I do want at this point just to pause and to say thank you very much to each and every one of our panelists, to Commissioner Schmidt, to Madame Paschier, to Mr. Levine, to Secretary of State Ray, to Deputy Minister Sanusi. Thank you for your voices. Thank you for your experience, your insights, and what you shared and deposited into the space with us today. As we wrap up this session today, allow me just to make one or two announcements before I release everyone as we go. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a 30-minute break, because in 30 minutes, 1600 hours if you're in my time zone, we're going to be kicking off with a partner session that is going to be led by the European Trade Union Confederation. And this session really is going to be looking at innovative approaches to implementing the next generation of EU social partner agreements. It's not a session that you want to miss by any means. It's going to be engaging, it's going to be important. And so we invite you to log in again in 30 minutes. This conversation that we've had today has really been a sign of the possibility of what building back better could really look like if we are to anchor it in social dialogue. The resounding message that I've heard today is that we're going to have to be more deliberate. We cannot assume that the blueprint will reset itself, and we've got to make sure that we're taking the big issues head on, tackling them head on, and making sure that we are laying them differently in the new blueprint of the emerging labor market that is anchored in social dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, from myself, Nozipho Shabalala, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll see you tomorrow for session 2, where we're really going to be looking very closely at global supply chains, which has been a key theme that has also come out of the conversation today. For now, it is goodbye. I hope you join the partner session at 4 o'clock. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow at 1400 hours. It's goodbye for now.